Hello and welcome to another Succeed with Dyslexia video. We are doing a campaign in the month of May around dyslexia and mental health, and we're finding the kind of the link and raising more awareness around that link between dyslexia and mental health. But ultimately, we want to raise more awareness around dyslexia. And we have had some incredible guests, all kind of sharing along with this campaign. And today we have another phenomenal guest who's going to be having a conversation literally around kind of the history around dyslexia. And I'm going to be absolutely fascinated to hear what Philip has to say around this. So please stay tuned and join in with the conversation. Philip, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I'm really intrigued to know more about this and the history of it. Philip, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be fantastic.
Yes, thank you, Darren. Well, my name is Philip Kirby. So I'm a lecturer in social science at King's College London. And one of the projects I work on is A History of Dyslexia. So this project started a few years ago when I was working as a researcher at the University of Oxford, led by two psychologists, Maggie Snowling and Kate Nation, and a historian, William White. And this project was about putting together the first UK dyslexia archive that was collecting records of major dyslexia organisations across the 20th century. And it was also about conducting a series of oral histories with key names across, again, the history of dyslexia in the UK. So people like Helen Arkell and people like, more recently, David Blunkett, we were interested in speaking to, the former education secretary, and how dyslexia changed in the late 1990s. And Baroness Warnock we spoke to, who wrote a kind of leading government report, Special Educational Needs in the 70s, which also mentioned dyslexia. So that's the project that I've been working on. And we have a book coming out on this project in the autumn, which will be the first history of dyslexia. So we've been very much interested in telling that story about where dyslexia came from in the late 19th century, right up to the present day.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm always fascinated because we always try and look back. I mean, dyslexia is. I feel I've been kind of in the dyslexia field for probably sort of 8-9 years. I'm dyslexic myself, so I feel like I'm always learning continuously more and more about it. But it's really prevalent to understand the history of dyslexia and how it's kind of formed. Could you share some of the findings that you've had, Philip, around?
Absolutely,
around
yeah.
that?
So dyslexia has a fascinating history. So it was first identified in the late 19th century by German scientists. So Adolf Kussmaul was a German physician, and he first identified this, as he called it, condition called word blindness. That was because at that time they thought that there might be a kind of underlying visual problem that people with dyslexia had, and that was causing the difficulty. Later, they found out that wasn't the case, but that's why there was that early interest from kind of ophthalmology. And the term itself was coined by Rudolf Berlin, who was another German physician in the 1880s, dyslexia, difficulty with words. So that's very much where the kind of scientific origins of dyslexia begin. Of course, the kind of difficulties that you see with dyslexia would have existed for the centuries before that, but it was only then that they first came to the attention of kind of medical science and were first identified as a kind of diagnostic category.
And it's interesting, isn't it? More than interest, it's fascinating how then we always think what was it like beforehand, and how did it formulate to have that decision to do the research around this? Was there any kind of findings on how this was created and founded?
Yeah, well, that's interesting too. So at the end of the 19th century, we see that kind of compulsory education in many Western countries, including the UK, is starting to come to the fore. And there's also just much more of a requirement for kind of widespread literacy to enter the workforce, for the professions, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the reasons that we see this emergence of dyslexia in the late 19th century is because educationist teachers are encountering many more children with these kinds of difficulties, and they're being brought to the attention of medical practitioners. And so you start to see this kind of nascent dyslexia science emerge. And after those Germans had first identified dyslexia, you see that British research has come to the fore. So in the early 20th century, in the very late 19th century, you have researchers in this country like James Hinchelwood, we start to develop dyslexia science a little bit and to understand more about it and to speculate that it might be something to do with kind of a phonological decoding difficulty in a very kind of primitive way that they were talking about it then. So really, Britain does have a very interesting kind of stake in those early scientific debates and actually laid a lot of the groundwork for later research on the condition across the 20th century.
That's absolutely fascinating. And what kind, because if we look at kind of modern day now, that how we kind of help and support, with assistive technology and all the different things that we, maybe it's colored paper or the different things that we've kind of learned, to have, it would be really kind of interesting to know, like, how back then they were kind of, they kind of thought, okay, there's something that we need to work on and look into, but it's how, what kind of tools would they have used back then? So I don't know if tools is used the correct terminology, but how would they have kind of tried to assist back then?
So there was little assistance really at that point. So the kinds of students and children with dyslexia that these doctors were encountering were very few. They're really right, and there was no kind of widespread provision for dyslexia in schools. What is quite interesting about these early scientists, though, is that they were fundamental, really, in shifting this idea that the dyslexic has difficulties with things that makes them stupid or that makes them have a lower IQ or something like that. That's what's causing their difficulties, which was quite common, I think, up until that point.
Yeah.
But they were laying out an evidence base that said, actually, no, this is a specific difficulty with language in particular areas, and it's nothing to do with kind of general ability or lack of work ethic or anything like that. So they were fundamental in, I think, shifting away from those much more prejudiced views about dyslexia that you did see up to that point. And you see a lot of kind of comments there that actually would only be borne out by science much later. So there was a physician at that time, Edward Treacher Collins, for example, who in the early 20th century noted that the kind of difficulties that those with dyslexia had would be much more pronounced in English, which has a very kind of non-transparent orthography. It's a much more complicated language to learn in some respects than in something like German, which has a much more transparent orthography. And the words are spelt a little bit more like you might expect them to be spelt because of how they sound. And again, decades and decades later, researchers like Uta Frith found that that was the case, that dyslexia does manifest differently in English, and there are more challenges in English than there are, for example, in German. So lots of these later ideas in science that have only been proven in recent decades were actually first identified in a very kind of nascent form right back then in the early 20th century.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I do think one of the things that I was going to do before the pandemic was travel to a couple of different countries, 7 different countries, and it was around kind of decoding dyslexia. So it was around kind of understanding how dyslexia is perceived in different languages. So the way that I see English, the English language, and someone else would see in France or Germany and all these different things. And it's really interesting when you say about how we see the language be decode, and it is in different languages, and I guess speaking the English language, I find that difficult in the sense from the dyslexic form, but someone else trying to learn the English language, I can imagine could be quite tricky along with dyslexia. Yeah,
that's right. And obviously the differences that a dyslexic learner might have in, or the different challenges they might have in learning different languages, that's also compounded by the fact that different countries, their science has proceeded in different kind of directions and at different rates, and political recognition, for example, of dyslexia has proceeded at different rates. So in the UK, we've been relatively fortunate in the sense that there has been political recognition relatively sooner than in many other countries. So in the middle of the 20th century, into the kind of 1960s, 1970s, we started to see kind of parents' rights organizations in this country. So organizations like the British Dyslexia Association and Dyslexia Action, or the Dyslexia Guild, as it was known earlier. Those kind of organizations come in and they lobby for political recognition of dyslexia, so for greater support in state schools for those that have these kind of difficulties. And they were very successful. And so by the later part of the 20th century, you saw that there was a substantial amount of support rolled out for for those with dyslexia in this country, and just a high level of kind of name recognition of dyslexia. So most people in this country, I think, would know what that term meant. They either have dyslexia themselves or they know someone that has dyslexia. And a lot of that kind of stigma around it has now disappeared in this country. Perhaps not totally, and there's certainly more support that could and should be given to those with dyslexia in state education and elsewhere. But there has been a much greater political recognition and kind of social recognition of dyslexia in this country than there has been in many other countries.
Absolutely, and I've experienced that firsthand. Going to Africa, for instance, I did some work over there with a school in Kenya, and dyslexia over there. I mean, it's even less well known in Malawi. But when I was over in Kenya, it was that from a political point of view. I remember a story of their president going on to national TV, and this is obviously on national TV, and announcing that his niece had dyslexia, and they were sending the child away to an island to be fixed, to be cured, so to speak. And then when she came back, he said that she was cured. And when you have someone with such an authority figure within that country saying these things, I can imagine, for an establishment that they were running as a school in Kenya, makes it even more difficult to make people, understand more about dyslexia. So,
yeah, I think that's right. I think there is probably a lot of stigma still around the world, in particular places, about dyslexia. If not stigma, simply ignorance and lack of knowledge about exactly what it is and the difficulties faced by the child that has dyslexia. And if you don't recognize those difficulties, then the kind of support that might be necessary and might be helpful to that child is then not forthcoming. So there's certainly a lot of work to do still in this country to an extent, but in other countries too, to kind of build recognition and societal understanding of dyslexia.
Yeah, and I feel we're very fortunate in one aspect within our country, because we tend to have fantastic establishments like the British Dyslexia Association, all these different phenomenal kind of places. And then there's small, real kind of small, organizations as well, collectively all trying to fight towards, the same case. And I guess as that spreads out across the world, there are obviously less organizations, and they're obviously still trying to, play catch up, I guess, throughout. So with that said, what do you think the kind of the definition around dyslexia? Do you feel that it's changed? In the research that you've done from the history of dyslexia, do you feel that the definition is changed slightly?
So I suppose the biggest change in the definition, there have been several large changes. So I think initially it was that transition from kind of ophthalmological research into research by psychologists. So this idea that it was something to do with visual acuity, which you do still see cropping up every now and then, this idea that it might be something about and visual abilities, although that's largely been discredited by the science. But that was originally what was thought, but then that's transitioned into psychology and understanding that it's a kind of developmental difficulty in understanding language in a particular way, decoding it phonologically. So that's probably been a big shift, that kind of movement towards psychology. In the earlier part of the 20th century and right up until the middle of the 20th century, there was also the discrepancy diagnostic model, which was very influential. So that was the idea that dyslexia could only be diagnosed where there was a substantial difference between reading IQ, as it were, and general IQ. So when you see that there's a large discrepancy between the two, that's how you can identify dyslexia. Actually, we know now that dyslexia exists across the kind of intellectual spectrum and spectrum of ability. So that's not a good way of identifying it. And I think that had a lot of kind of negative repercussions socially, certainly in the middle part of the 20th century, because you saw those arguments, dyslexia is a kind of middle-class myth. Dyslexia is something that posh kids have and poorer kids don't have it. They just have difficulty at school. And so you started to see this kind of sense of elitism around dyslexia, certainly in the middle part of the 20th century, because of that diagnostic model. But as that's been superseded in the science, so I think we've started to see a fading of that idea that kind of dyslexia is a middle class disease, as many of those arguments in those earlier decades would have had it.
And Do you feel with the research that you've done now, and obviously as everything evolves, where do you see this kind of going in the future, with regards to kind of how dyslexia is obviously founded and obviously and we've evolved, but where do you see the kind of the landscape sitting going forward, if you wouldn't mind sharing?
Yeah, well, that's interesting too. So I'm not a futurologist, I'm a historian, but
yes.
But yeah, I suppose there's all kinds of different changes happening in society now, which might benefit those with dyslexia in particular kind of ways. So we're starting to see, I think, the advent of kind of video-based and image-based technologies for communication, for example. Certainly literacy is not of the same importance or used in the same way in kind of general life as it once was. So it's possible that there'll be kind of technological innovations like that, which might start to benefit those who have dyslexia. I mean, in terms of the science, we're also seeing a lot more research by kind of neuroscientists and brain research to kind of really understand exactly what's happening in the brain and why some people have these difficulties with language and others don't. So I think that there's a lot of scope for science to learn more and more about dyslexia. And we're also seeing better and better interventions, so support strategies for those that have dyslexia. Psychology is really focusing on this at the moment. So randomized controlled trials where they'll give a particular intervention to those that have dyslexia and then have a control group, and then they can see how much that is helping the group that have dyslexia. And a lot of money is being poured into that area at the moment. So I think hopefully over coming decades, we'll see better and better strategies that are able to help those that have dyslexia.
Fantastic. Philip, it's been absolutely fantastic hearing all about the history of dyslexia. It's one of the questions that we get asked quite a lot. And when I'm on kind of different groups and forums, it's always a case of how, it always stems back to how it was first identified and obviously that, the reason behind it. But if people, I know you mentioned that if you have an incredible book coming out, which is obviously, a collective of the research you're doing. If you would, how can people get in touch with yourself, of contact with yourself to maybe look at the incredible work you're doing? Obviously, purchase the book when it's released.
Yes. So my profile page at King's, Philip Kirby, and put in KCL, something like that, and then you could definitely able to find my profile, and then it has all the writings associated with the project. And there is also a website still in existence at the University of Oxford where the project started, History of Dyslexia. So again, if you Googled that term, History of Dyslexia, it should pop up. And there's a website there. It has extracts from the interviews that we've conducted with the kind of great and the good of the 20th century. And it has a timeline and it has other resources about the project. And then, as you mentioned, yes, in the autumn, so hopefully in September, myself and Maggie Snowling, who's a psychologist at Oxford, publishing Dyslexia: A History, and that should be available in the autumn to buy. And that has the complete history of dyslexia right from the end of the 19th century right up to the present day, kind of exemplifying and elucidating the kind of themes that we've been talking about today.
Absolutely, and that will be an absolute fascinating read. And within Succeed, we'll continue to share the incredible work that you're doing. And obviously, please, do let us know when this book is released.
Thank you, Darren. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. It's been absolutely incredible speaking with you. And we will catch up with you very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for all the work that Succeed with Dyslexia are doing too.
Bless you. Thank you, Philip. Take care.
Thank you, Darren. Take care. Bye-bye.
That brings us to the end of this interview. Throughout the month of May, we've had the awesome opportunity to speak to some incredible people with a focus on the relationship between mental health and dyslexia. Please feel free to click this link here and learn more about Margaret Rook as she talks about her own experience as an author and some of the things that she's learned in conjunction with mental health and dyslexia. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.